All right, the topic of today's review is evolution, and then I'm going to throw some classification in there. Okay, so guys, I don't know why students traditionally don't do so well on evolution. It really boils down to common ancestors, surviving and reproducing, and better suited to your environment. Okay, so don't try not to make it so difficult. I want you to think more common sense. If you have an adaptation that allows you to survive and reproduce, then in terms of Darwin, you've been pretty darn successful. Okay? All right, so when Darwin was doing his studies, the first thing he said is that in order for evolution to even need to take place is everything's going to produce too many offspring. Okay, and that is the case in every living thing. All right, think about like all the pollen that falls in April and May. If every single one of those pollen grains became a pine tree, there'd be nothing but pine trees around here. So obviously, they're going to struggle, which is the second step. There has to be some competition. Okay, too many of them, they all need the same resources. But some organisms are going to have better adaptations, and therefore, those are the ones that are going to survive and reproduce and pass on those adaptations. Okay, so those are the four things in the order that they happen. Too many offspring, they're going to struggle and compete. The ones who are better adapted or better suited for their environment are going to survive and reproduce. Okay, so I want you to make sure you know the difference between natural selection and artificial selection. Artificial means man is involved in it. So an example of that is all the different breeds of dogs that we have on the planet now. Okay, that probably wouldn't have happened if nature just took its course on its own. And every time we create, quote unquote, some new species, that is when man is involved in it. That is not what Darwin meant by natural selection. So in those terms, it's those with the best adaptations survive and reproduce and pass on those traits. So an adaptation is anything you inherit for survival. So it could be thorns, it could be a nasty smell, it could be a dangerous chemical, it could be a hard coating on your shell. Basically anything that helps you survive in your habitat. Okay, so remember that your adaptation is only as good as where you live. So for an example, a polar bear being white or a snow hare being white would do them absolutely no good in North Carolina. Okay, all right, so some other things that I want you to remember, you have to recognize these three graphs here. Stabilizing means you favor the average individuals, so that's what's happening here. Directional means you favor one end or the other. So generally speaking, like for an example with basketball, it generally favors taller people. I'm not saying short people can't play. I'm just saying taller people are favored. And it doesn't mean that everybody that is tall can play basketball. Okay, but height is a favored trait in basketball. Just like being really small is favored if you're a horse jockey. Okay, disruptive is kind of like the crazy one. That means you don't want to be average. So the average is selected against. So it prefers the light ones and the dark ones, not the medium ones, or the small ones and the big ones, not the medium ones. So stabilizing and disruptive are exact opposites. So disruptive is easily seen because the graph looks like an M kind of, where the average ones are dying out. And stabilizing is just the opposite. You want to be average. And then directional is easy to recognize because it moves one way or the other. All right? Okay, so variation is just differences in individuals, and you guys might see this a lot in the genetics section also. Variation is favored in terms of populations because the more variety you have, generally speaking, the more chances you have for survival. If you have a corn plant in a field and they're all genetically identical, if a disease comes in and it can wipe out one, it can wipe them all out. Okay, so variation is important. And then homologous structures were one of the things that Darwin used to prove common ancestors. It means a similar structure but different function, and it shows a common ancestor. So like even if you were to look at the bones in our arm and the bones in a whale, even though the whale looks very different than other mammals, it has the same bone structure. So Darwin would say that it had a common ancestor somewhere way down the line. Other things he used to prove that were vestigial structures, which are things that we're losing that we used to have, and maybe a common ancestor had it. Okay, and then he used some embryos, and he used where they lived. Okay, those were things that he used. But I want you to remember, in the year 2021, if the best evidence for a common ancestor right now is either DNA or RNA or proteins or something along those lines. Okay, if they discover some new fish in the ocean today, they're not going to be like, I think it looks like the hammerhead shark, or I think it looks like this. They're going to get the DNA and prove what it is more closely related to. All right. And then also some things that I forgot to put on the other study guide. I typed them up here. The different kinds of isolations. These are things that stop organisms from breeding or reproducing together. Geographic is an easy one. That's some land barrier that's keeping them apart. So it could be a mountain range. It could be a canyon. It could be one's on one island and one's on the other and they can't get to them. It could be something as simple as a fence. That's how we keep a lot of our dogs and other pets separate from other ones, okay? Behavioral is also easy. That is some kind of behavior that sets them apart, like a song or a dance or a coloration. And then temporal is the hardest one to remember, just because it doesn't sound like it, but I want you to think of T for timing. So like maybe one flower blooms in the spring and another flower blooms in the winter, so therefore those two flowers would not mate with one another, right? Okay, on to classification. Remember that they used to use only two kingdoms, plant and animal, and that was before they had microscopes and before they knew all the other billions of things that existed besides those two. So now we have 6 kingdoms, Archaebacteria, Eubacteria, protist, fungi, plant, animal. When I was in high school, these two were combined in one, and they were just called bacteria or Monarans. But now they know that these guys are so different from these that they put them into their own category. And then once you put things into these kingdoms, we use these taxa to kind of classify them. So kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And you do have to know this particular order. There are not many things in biology where you have to know a specific order, but this is one of them. All right. And then when you name something, we use the genus and species, which are the last two. So as an example, humans are Homo sapiens. Dogs can be like Canis familiaris. Cats could be Felis something or another. I can't remember the species name. So all 7 of these things classify us, but universally, the genus and species is the same in the entire world. Okay, so we might call something a red-breasted robin, but it has a scientific name that is known worldwide. It is normally Latin-based, and we call that binomial nomenclature. All right, and another skill you have to be able to do in here, which y'all were very good at that, is a cladogram. This kind of shows evolutionary relationships and common ancestry. So every time you put a trait in here, this is something that has evolved in the future species. So for example, the gorilla and the tiger, even though they're both mammals, how they're separated is no tail. Okay, so all of these have a tail, whereas this one doesn't. Usually they'll do the most primitive to the most advanced, and if there was something over here, it would probably be the common ancestor to them. Okay, and then just really quickly an overview of the 6 kingdoms here, and I'm going to go backwards because we know the most about these. Animals are multicellular, we are heterotrophs, which means we have to eat our own food, and our cells have no cell wall. That's one of the things that distinguishes us from the rest of them, all right? Plants are all autotrophs. That's what distinguishes them. They have a cell wall. They are multicellular. They do photosynthesis. There are 4 groups of plants. You've got ferns, mosses, gymnosperms, which are like the pine tree kind of things, and angiosperms, which is anything that makes a flower. Fungi do have a cell wall, but they are heterotrophic. So the one thing that separates these 2 kingdoms, cell wall, no cell wall. Protists are single-celled, but they are eukaryotic, so that means they do have a nucleus. And then these 2 kingdoms, prokaryotic. Bacteria are the normal things that we think of, like strep and all those other things. And archaebacteria are the really super weird guys that live in like sulfur vents and things like that. Okay? All right, so guys, there are more questions for you to practice with evolution. Remember what I said. Look for common ancestor, look for survive and reproduce, look for adaptation or something like that. And 9 out of 10 times, those are going to be the correct answer. Okay? Please email me if you have any questions. Take care.